What do I have? Nothing. No. We'll have some good times here. So Jesus is talking here with his disciples. And it's in your bulletin if you want to follow along. His disciples said, "Yes, now you are speaking plainly, not in any figure of speech. Now we know that you know all things and do not need to have anyone question you. By this we believe that you came from God." Jesus answered them, "Do you now believe? The hour is coming, indeed it has come, when you will be scattered, each one to his home, and you will leave me alone. Yet I am not alone, because the Father is with me. I have said this to you so that in me you may have peace. In the world you face persecution, but take courage, I have conquered the world." Many people believe that when something good happens to us, God is involved. But let's ask the converse. Does that mean that when something bad occurs, God is also involved? When so-called natural disasters strike, some people are quick to make statements that God is punishing sinful people or sinful places with these disasters. For example, in the wake of Hurricane Katrina, televangelist John Hagee declared, and I quote, "All hurricanes are acts of God because God controls the heavens." And I continue, "I believe that New Orleans had a level of sin that was offensive to God, and I believe that Hurricane Katrina was, in fact, the judgment of God against the city of New Orleans." End of quote. Now, New Orleans is obviously a place that celebrates gambling and debauchery, including the annual observance of Mardi Gras. How many of you want to admit you've been to Mardi Gras? Yes. So there's, of course, drunkenness and nakedness and gambling and overeating and all kinds of over-the-top behavior that occurs in New Orleans. And Mardi Gras was actually scheduled just a few days after Katrina hit. But not all people of faith thought that God chose Katrina as punishment for the city of New Orleans. And more than New Orleans suffered because of Katrina. John Shelby Spong, a theologian, a retired Episcopal bishop, weighed in with these words that were completely the opposite thought. He said, and I quote, "The idea of God sitting on a throne above the clouds, manipulating the weather in order to punish sinners is so primitive and so naive that it is staggering to the educated imagination. It is surely not a God of love who punishes New Orleans' poorest citizens with a hurricane that New Orleans' wealthiest citizens could and did manage to escape with their lives because they had cars." End of quote. So today we're continuing with our study about what Americans believe about God. And we're basing this study on a book by Paul Froese and Christopher Bader called America's Four Gods, What We Say About God and What That Says About Us. They did an intensive study and survey around the United States and found some distinctive differences about how we understand God. And using these theological differences, they split the American public into four categories. And if you haven't been here so far, those are listed in your bulletin about Americans who believe in a God who's both engaged in the world and judgmental. That's the authoritative God. Then Americans who believe in a God who is engaged yet non-judgmental. That's the benevolent God. And then Americans who believe in a God who is judgmental but not engaged. That's the critical God. And then finally, Americans who believe in a non-judgmental and disengaged God, the distant God. So today we're talking about how your understanding of God impacts your thinking about evil. Now, I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands about which kind of God you believe in, because I think that's too much to ask you to disclose about yourself. But I do hope that you're talking amongst the people you go to lunch with, or your friends in the church, or even people outside the church about what you think of God. And I hope this is sparking discussion for you. If you don't have anyone to talk to, or you're not sure, some of you have hit me up in Fellowship Hall and have said, I'm not sure where I fit. And I've helped some of you decide where you fit in this whole scheme by asking you some questions. So if you're still not sure where you fit, talk to me and I'll ask you some questions to help you decide. So today I can see you're really excited because we're going to talk about evil. Are you ready? Okay. So 17% of Americans assert that God, at least at times, causes disaster as a warning to sinners. And more of us are actually uncomfortable with God causing the disaster. So we hedge our bets and we say that God allows disasters to happen. 27% of Americans believe that God allows or lets, but doesn't actually cause disasters to happen. If you believe in a benevolent God, and again, look in your bulletin for that definition, you might believe that God intervenes when bad things happen. So some people, for example, claimed that God held up the Twin Towers for an extra 30 minutes so that people could escape. Others suggested that God created traffic jams in downtown Manhattan to reduce the number of people in the buildings that day. So that's hedging your bets a bit. Now, more Americans, about 60% when asked, believe that God plays absolutely no role at all in tragedy. And we offer a variety of explanations about that. We say, for example, there's free will in humanity, or God just doesn't intervene in our daily lives, or God set in motion natural law, and natural law takes over, so God doesn't intervene in our world. Americans who believe in an authoritative God are the ones who are most likely to believe in a God who causes disaster. Bad things that happen are a sign, they say, of God being angry or warning us or calling us into action. And so they imagine a world in which evil forces lurk everywhere, and they see the world as a place of spiritual struggle between good and evil. In fact, they often call this spiritual warfare, a continual struggle between good and evil. Some people take this very, very seriously. Several popular books have been written about spiritual warfare and the use of prayer and angelic intervention to win the battle between good and evil. And if you take this a bit farther, think about it in terms of political theory. After the 9/11 attacks, President George W. Bush talked about the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan as his mission from God. His national foreign policy urged us to be on the offensive in a war of terror. He understood and made a strong case for a fight between good and evil, between a Christian nation and terrorists, between right and wrong. A quote from our authors in the book: "Ideas of war go hand in hand with ideas about God. When a person strongly believes that the world is faced with true evil and that God may punish us for failing to fight those forces, she or he will be highly motivated to heed the call. Believers in an authoritative God tend to think that great disasters are either caused by or allowed by God. But in either case, they feel that tragedies are divine warning signs, and disasters occur in the United States are especially significant because these disasters tend to feel that America is favored and closely watched by God. That's the end of the quote. So, conversely, Americans who believe in a distant God are the most skeptical about the existence of evil coming from things such as Satan or demons. They are also less interested in cataclysmic end times in which evil will ultimately be vanquished. Instead, people who believe in a distant God worry that tragic events and disasters are probably the result of human action or inaction, of natural randomness, or of dumb luck. So believers in a critical God will also share the same worldview. And both types of believers really don't see disaster as a supernatural war between good and evil, but as a natural or human-produced disaster. And then believers in critical and distant gods find world affairs a bit shocking and even antagonistic to their faith. They don't like to think about worldly conflicts or disasters in terms of spiritual terms. Finally, believers in a benevolent God may support war, but they don't tend to think that God plays a role in destruction. They do like to think that God provides protection for faithful soldiers, and they focus on God's love and mercy during times of hardship. Believers in a benevolent God are more likely to see God's hand in daily events, but they tend to dismiss or ignore the issue of why God lets these tragedies occur. So they focus on the good things that God brings from the tragedy or the bad things, and they are optimists. So have you figured out where you stand on this 4-scale plan about God? Most of us haven't always been aware that our images of God actually determine our theories about evil and our political ideology. But it certainly influences how we and how others think. And if you think through, I'd use President George W. Bush as an example because it's a really stark, recent example. But every president has a theology, and it influences their national polity. Okay? Next week, we're going to wrap up this series by talking about how our ideas about God impact our thoughts about the future. And a reminder that I'm always interested in hearing your ponderings and your ideas about the sermon and your impact in your input on these topics. So next week, your ideas about God and how it impacts the future. I hope you're finding this interesting, your ideas about God. So as you're able, please stand and let's sing Shalom. So don't forget the concert this afternoon as a fundraiser for His Helping Hands, 3 o'clock at Central Christian, and the Barbershop Choir is going to be the presenter. And then as you go forward this week, I encourage you to think more about God and your views on how your ideas about how God shape your ideas in the world and how that works with evil, your political theory, and is God involved in natural disasters, in things that happen, or is God distant and uninvolved in the things that happen in the world? And then listen to what other people say about that. Go forth and have a wonderful week. Amen.